Doctors Richard Carrier, Dennis MacDonald. I have another patron who is a huge supporter of what we do. He says, besides 2 Corinthians and the Gospels, do they believe any other New Testament book is a composite document? And I'll just preface it with saying this. We're already supposing 2 Corinthians, based on the question, that it's a composite. The Gospels, we know your Johannine, obviously the Gospel of John is 3 layers in your view.
And let's make clear that's not just Dennis's view. I think that's the leading view of Johannine scholars now. So that's a mainstream position.
That's right.
Okay.
That John has gone through multiple edits and stuff has been added over time and subtracted.
So what we're left with is
around.
The Revelator and the epistles.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis can comment on Revelation. I have no firm opinions on that, but what he's talking about is plausible, that Revelation had a preface and an ending that were tacked on and later that were not original. I think all of the authentic Pauline letters, the 7 authentics, the classic ones, except for Philemon, which that's in a liminal case where we can't really prove that that's actually Paul, and it's not composite whether it was Paul or not. But the others, I think there's scholarship arguing that these are all composite letters. There's evidence in them that these are all stitches together of multiple letters. So like Romans is actually multiple letters that someone stitched together. 1 Corinthians, same way. 2 Corinthians, same way, and so on all the way down the line. And I cite some of the scholarship, and I mention this on the historicity of Jesus. So if you're interested in that, and it's, for me, it's just an aside. Like it's not crucial to any argument that I make in the book. But if you want to look into the scholarship on that, I've got a bibliography in the book on the historicity of Jesus.
Can I probe on that just a quick second before we get done this? Do you find it possible, you've written on this, and I don't know why I thought about this, since they're stitched letters together, is it possible in your view that some of the stitched stuff into the authentics might have been pseudo-Paul into an authentic Paul?
I mean, it's theoretically possible, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. It looks like whoever put that collection together was taking a dossier of Paul's letters and picking and choosing what pieces to put together, right? Okay. Otherwise, they're fairly coherent stylistically and ideologically. Unlike, for example, Colossians or Ephesians, where you can show really strong stylometric differences between them. Philemon is too short, so it's hard to nail that down with stylometric technology. You can't really do a statistical analysis because there's too few words in it. So that one, and since there's, for me, nothing ideologically relevant, I don't use Philemon, so I don't have to make a decision as to whether it's authentic or not. So I have less of a firm opinion about that. But the other 6 in the 7 are definitely coherent in terms of the same person wrote them, basically. As to where these stitches came from, we don't really know. I mean, it makes me wonder, why, if you have Romans, it could be all those letters to Rome that pieces stitched together. But why do we have a 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right? Why are they broken up? And I'm wondering if they had 2 satchels of letters to Corinth, and then the first satchel take pieces of and make it into 1 Corinthians. I don't know. That's a hypothesis. Otherwise, I don't know why they broke 1 Corinthians into 2, or why they broke the Corinthian letters into 2. But yeah, there is some scholarship supporting that these are stitches together. And some people might know, especially viewers of yours might know, that Robert Price has argued that the letters as we have them are too long to be plausible, authentic letters, right? Because normally, even administrative letters and homily-based letters are usually not that long. We have other collections from Pliny and Cicero and so on. These letters of this length are unusual. I think that's a weak argument on one hand, because I think these are particular types of literature for which we don't really have comparables. So it could well be that, the Church of Isis has these long ideological letters too, but we don't have any collections of ISIS cult letters, so we don't know, right? But on the other side, the evidence is very clear that there has been some stitching going on, and in some cases it's indisputable. Like there's parts where there's an introduction to a letter just suddenly reappears in the middle of a letter, right? So there's some cases like that. It's pretty obvious it is. And there's others that are less obvious, but you can still show evidentially that there's something has gone on here, that things have been smashed together that weren't originally together before. So I think that would answer to Robert Price's argument, is that these were really originally shorter letters, and they just got put into these books that became sort of a manual that people were using to argue for current events, even though Paul was responding to specific problems in his day. The collection was published to be as kind of a manual or a hand guide for solving problems in the future, right? So I think that's the person who assembled it, that's their goal. But in result, we've lost a lot of material, obviously. So one of these examples is 1 Corinthians 8, the transition from 8 to 9. And they're sort of thematically related, 8 and 9. but they're clearly came from completely different letters or completely different contexts, because when you go from 8, suddenly in 9:1, Paul is responding to some completely different argument. And usually Paul like explains the argument that he's responding to and then goes in, but we have no idea of the context of the argument of 9:1. Whatever was in between 8 and 9 is gone. And I don't think it was like 8 used to go through something else and then get to 9. I think this is someone took that section out of another letter, wherever chapter 9 came from, and slammed it in, packed it in right after 1 Corinthians 8. And they did that because thematically they were kind of related and whatever. And they didn't care about the actual particular context in which Paul was responding to. They only cared about the use of the material for other ideological problems that they wanted to solve, right? So that I think is one of those good examples where there's something missing at the very least. There's passages have been removed, but I think more likely what we're looking at is that's a stitch point between two different letters that have been put together because they were thematically similar. And there's others. There's scholars who've written on the stitching of Romans and Philippians and so on.
Dionysus? No.
I tend to be more Unitarian on the Pauline letters than Richard is, but I think we have more integrity with the Pauline letters than Richard might admit to. On the other hand, I think the Corinthian letters and Philippians are very good examples of stitching together. And by the way, we know that this happens in antiquity with other texts. One piece of the puzzle, I think, that I would add is that Paul did not spend a lot of time, as far as we know, either at Philippi or Macedonia or at Corinth. And in both cases, we have indications that people wanted him to spend more time there than he did. The function of these letters is that Paul can address the congregation without preaching to them in person.
That's a really good point, but yeah, keep going. There's First Clement is an example of this, but go on.
Yeah, exactly. And First Clement, I know you date First Clement differently, so I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, but it was intentionally written to be read out as a homily, essentially, right? So that's why Price's argument wouldn't apply here, because the letter's purpose is different. It's meant to be the presence of Clement is supposed to be represented by the person who reads this out to the community. So the length of the letter is relevant. Like it's supposed to be long because it's supposed to like represent Clement being there, essentially.
Yeah.
And because I'm suspicious that the church in Corinth valued these letters as though he were there himself and collected them and then published them in these two corpora
I see.
because to preserve his memory of their church. The same thing could happen in Philippi, where the Philippians kept various correspondences of Paul because they valued his word because he didn't spend a lot of time there. Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus, but the letter to the Ephesians is not written by Paul. You don't need to write to the church where you're preaching, right? So
Right.
I think it's rather interesting.
Yeah.
The other, though, is I want to go to the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation alleges that it's written by a John the Seer, but only in verses 1 to 9a and in chapter 21, or the last chapter of the Apocalypse. These are bookends, and it's common in Jewish literature to take earlier literature and to bookend it, and with ascriptions. This was written by so and so or whatever. We have it in Christian apocryphal texts too, where we have something that may have an earlier existence, and then it gets ascribed in a secondary way. In my view, the visions in from 9:1-9b to the second to the penultimate chapter of the Apocalypse, these visions are written in the 90s. And one reason to say that is Papias at 2 points seems to know the apocalypse. He too is a Chiliast, believes in the 1,000-year earthly reign, and seems to be a part of the Johannine tradition. But but he doesn't refer to any passage in this what could be the later addition and an inscription to John. In my view, and this has evidence, but it certainly is contested, is that the person who wrote the final chapter of the Gospel of John intended it to be a bridge to a collection of the Johannine epistles, followed by the Apocalypse of John ascribed to John. And here then you have a very clever statement about this is the gospel of the beloved disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and we know there are other gospels, but this is the one we think is cool. Then you go to 1 John. The elder himself is writing, what we have seen and heard and handled of the word of life we pass on to you. So even in canon moratori, which we talked about in another clip, seems to put the Gospel of John just before 1 John. And that seems how Clement seems to have made that same move. You go from 1 John to 2 John to 3 John, and they have their own translations. And at the end of 3 John, the author says, I have many more things to write to you. I hope to write to you when I can come. Then if the Apocalypse followed that, this John, another John, is on the island of Patmos, and he can't visit these other churches, so he has to write them. And so these letters are an ersatz presence for him. And then the visions of the Apocalypse are embedded inside of this framework. In other words, we have a Johannine corpus, which in a way is the beginning of the sequence of literature in the New Testament itself, which begins with Gospels. Think the Gospel of John in the Johannine corpus. Moves to epistles, right? And this is the Johannine collection of epistles. And the New Testament ends with the Apocalypse ascribed to John. So it's possible that the Christian canon as we have it right now actually reflects the Johannine arrangement that follows the life of the beloved disciple from John the Baptist. He was a follower of John the Baptist. Through his witness, he was the last of the generation to die. We have a collection of his letters that he wrote during his lifetime, and we have some letters that he wrote to the 7 churches, and embedded in it is this projection of what's going to happen in the future. It really is an elegant collection, in my view. But we don't have any physical evidence for the collection except one possible manuscript that has pages numbered, and there's a big gap in the numbering, and the numbering resumes, and it's just about the right space for putting the Johannine epistles. So you have the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse. You have this missing section. And this has been, Charles Hill is the person who has that evidence. The evidence is not conclusive because it's based on a lacuna. But we have to live with what we have. But so that would be my answer. The person who asked the question is very astute. He or she already recognizes that 2 Corinthians is a composite, is willing to grant that some of the Gospels may be composite as well, and is asking how far does that process extend. Richard thinks that we have more of that kind of thing going on than I do, but we both agree that it happened. I happen to have a particular understanding of the Johannine tradition that suggests that the book of Revelation came out of at least 2 compositional layers, moments, and some people have argued that it comes out as many as 5 or 7. Now, I don't hold to that position because it's based, in my opinion, on somewhat undisciplined methodology. But it certainly is possible that it's a multiply complex document.
Yeah, right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that show. I have hundreds of other ones on the Patreon, letting you guys know you can help us continue doing what we're doing at MythVision Podcast. Also, you can have questions asked to the academics that I research with and I interview. Your question can be asked in a 1080p high quality video that might end up on YouTube. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to expose the cults, show these superstitions for what they are, and the errors within these texts and all of these religions to help people realize they're all man-made and that we have what it takes. All we need to do is pull together. Let me tell you something. The religious world has the financial backing that those skeptics such as myself don't have. So if you want to help and be a participant, you can for a little bit a month. It's not much. If you want to go more, you can. But like I said, this is how I can keep the lights on for MythVision.